The wind on Zephyr 9 did not whistle. It screamed. Sharp and endless across the frozen ridges, it carried nothing but the memory of things long buried beneath snow and silence. The planet was a graveyard of frost, and Calen Ward had chosen to live right in its heart. He was a shadow now, a man who had once saved lives, now choosing exile. No neighbors, no signals, no voices, only the groan of old metal in his shelter walls and the low hum of the heater that barely worked. Until the voice came. It crackled through his wrist comm like a whisper from another world. A burst of static, then a gasp, then 5 words thin and shaking. Please, rock, help, cold. Calen froze. The voice was female, broken, alien. He hadn't heard a soul in months, maybe years. The sound cut through the quiet like a blade. His first instinct was caution. Pirates fake distress calls all the time. Lure someone out, strip their shelter clean. But this voice, it carried something else. Pain. He tapped the screen. A single ping. Coordinates. Just past the lower ridge. Less than 2 kilometers away. His breath steamed in the cold air as he stared at the snow swirling outside his window. The storm was building. Wind rising. Visibility dropping. But still, he moved. Grabbed his coat. Pulled on his frost mask. Took the old energy rifle. Stepped into the white. The snow hit like needles. Each step sank deep. The wind shoved at him, tried to knock him down. He pushed forward anyway, head bowed, boots grinding into the ice. Time slowed in the storm. He lost all sense of direction. Only the blinking dot on his wrist comm kept him moving. Then, metal. Half buried in a drift, its surface scorched and cracked. Smoke drifted in faint curls. A small escape pod. Not human design. Sleek. Curved. The hatch was open. He ran. Inside, she was curled like something folded by pain, pale blue skin covered in frost. One arm twisted unnaturally. Her lips were turning gray. Her breath came in short, desperate pulls. Then her eyes opened. She looked up at him, eyes wide, frightened, beautiful. And then she spoke. Please. One word, soft as breath, but it cracked something in Calen that had stayed frozen for years. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He lifted her gently into his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like snow shaped into a girl. The wind howled louder, the pod hissed behind him, lights blinking their final flickers. But Calen was already moving, back through the storm, each step harder than the last. She didn't speak again. Her head rested against his chest, her skin ice cold. At one point he slipped, fell to his knees, nearly dropped her. But he didn't stop. Not after coming all this way. Not now. By the time he reached the shelter, his arms were numb and his legs shaking. The door slid open with a grinding creak. Warm air blasted out. He laid her on the old cot, tore open the med kit, heat serum, thermal wrap, emergency stabilizer. His hands worked with the calm precision of someone who had done this too many times before. Her fingers twitched. Her lips moved. He leaned in. But no words came. Only a single tear slipped down her cheek. Calen whispered, "You're safe now." She didn't answer. But for the first time in a long time, the silence in the shelter didn't feel so empty. The wind outside still screamed, but inside the shelter it was quiet, wrapped in the dull glow of heater coils and the soft buzz of a damaged med scanner. Calen sat in the old chair near the cot, one hand resting on his knee, the other ready to grab the rifle leaning against the wall. But his eyes never left her. The girl hadn't moved since he brought her in. Her breathing was steady now, barely. Her skin had lost that dangerous gray tint, but the blue remained, like she had been carved from a glacier. Her arm was wrapped in soft bandages, her forehead damp with the fever that always followed cryo exposure. He didn't know her name, didn't know if she'd wake up again, but he didn't leave. He watched. He waited. And hours passed. The fire cracked in the corner. Sparks climbed into the vent above like tired spirits, fading into the dark. Calen didn't sleep. He just stared at her and wondered what he was doing. He had come to Zephyr 9 to disappear, not to become a rescuer again, not to care. But something in her voice, when she said please, had unhooked a part of him he thought he had buried in the snow years ago. Suddenly the girl stirred. Her fingers twitched beneath the blanket. Her head rolled gently toward the heat. Her eyes fluttered, then opened. Silver, pale, unfocused at first, then sharp. She saw him and panicked. Her breath hitched, her body tensed. She tried to sit up and gasped in pain, arm pressing to her chest. Calen raised both hands, palms out. "Hey, easy. You're okay." She didn't respond. Her gaze darted around the room, searching. Walls, corners, exits. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was cracked, but strong enough to hold fear. Calen didn't move. "Name's Calen Ward. Found you in the snow. Why did you bring me here? Because you were dying." She stared at him like that didn't make sense. "You're human." "Yeah. Your kind doesn't help mine." He raised an eyebrow. "Yours doesn't help mine either." "Maybe that's why we're both out here alone." She said nothing. Her breathing slowed. He stood slowly, walked to the heater, poured water from the kettle into a metal cup. The steam rose into the air like lazy ghosts. "You were unconscious for 2 days. I gave you a heat serum. Set your arm. Stop the internal bleeding." She took the cup from his hand carefully, eyes still on him. She sipped, winced, drank again. He stepped back. "What's your name?" She hesitated. "Lyra, of House Varel, from the Adric system." He nodded, sitting again. "Fancy title. It used to mean something. Not anymore." Silence stretched between them. Not heavy. Just there. Eventually he asked, "That pod of yours didn't crash by accident, did it?" She looked away. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I ran." "From what?" "From people who said they were protecting me." Calen didn't push further. He simply nodded. He understood running. Later he brought her a plate of rehydrated protein cubes and freeze-dried stew. She sniffed it, wrinkled her nose. "What is this?" "Edible." "Barely." She took a bite, chewed, grimaced. "You weren't lying." He smiled faintly. She ate the rest anyway. "Where are we?" "Outpost 9, Zephyr Ridge, middle of nowhere." "Why are you here?" His smile faded. "I used to be a rescue tech. Earth colonies, crashed ships, trapped miners. I was good. Until I wasn't." She looked at him. "What happened?" "A dome collapse. A boy. Too late. Everyone blamed me. The company, the father, and I believed them. So I left." He leaned back. "Came here, where no one needs saving." Lyra didn't say anything. Then softly, "But you did save me." He looked at her, didn't answer. "And yet you did." That night Lyra couldn't sleep. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the wind claw at the walls. She thought of the lab she escaped from, the silent halls, the white coats, the wires, and then she looked across the room at Calen, asleep, still in his chair, rifle within reach, but not pointed at her. No chains, no threats, just warmth, just presence. She whispered something in her own language, words her mother once said. "Kindness is rare. When it finds you, hold on." And in that quiet shelter, with frost clinging to the walls and sorrow thick in the air, she felt safe, for the first time in years. Morning came slowly on Zephyr 9. It wasn't marked by sunlight, just a softening of the gray, a little less weight in the clouds, a gentler bite to the wind. Calen Ward moved quietly through the narrow trees behind his shelter, snow crunching beneath his boots. His breath formed small clouds in the frozen air, disappearing as fast as they came. He didn't want to leave Lyra alone, but the supply run couldn't wait. The heater was running low. The med packs were almost gone, and she needed food, real food, not processed cubes that tasted like ash. At the edge of the ravine, nestled between two frozen stones, lay the rusting remains of an old cargo hauler. Years ago, Calen had gutted it for scraps, and over time, it became his hidden stash. Old cables, broken drones, salvaged batteries, and half-burnt solar sheets. He knelt down, brushing snow from the storage bin. The lock hissed open, but something was wrong. Inside, near the back, blinking softly beneath a cracked datapad, was a device he had never seen before. Sleek, silver, smooth edges, and at its core, a small red pulse. Slow, steady, alive. Calen's stomach dropped. A tracker. He picked it up carefully, turned it over. Not human tech. Xeric design. He stood quickly, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. No sounds. No footprints but his own. Too quiet. Back at the shelter, Lyra sat near the heater, wrapped in an oversized blanket. Her hair was damp from the melted snow, her skin still pale but warmer. She stared at the flames like they were telling stories only she could hear. The door opened fast. Calen entered, boots covered in frost, eyes hard. "We need to talk." Lyra stood, sensing the shift in his voice. He held up the device. "Found this near the hauler." She stared at it, and then, slowly, her face drained of color. "That's Xeric." "Yeah, I figured." She sat down heavily. Calen moved closer. "Who's looking for you?" Her hands gripped the edge of the blanket. She looked up, eyes distant. "They're not coming to rescue me. They're coming to erase me." Calen sat across from her, waiting. She swallowed hard, then began. "I was part of something, a project, hidden from the public, hidden even from some of our own people. They used orphans, children with no record, no names. We were numbers, subjects. They tested on us." She looked at her hands. "Changed us. Changed you how?" "DNA splicing, neural weaving, energy interface mapping. Powers?" She nodded. "Memory transference, biocharging, reflex enhancements. Things they didn't even understand themselves." Calen stayed quiet. "I wasn't the strongest," she said softly. "Just the only one who lived." He leaned back. "Processing. They tried to kill you." She nodded again. "When I found out what I was, I ran, stole a pod, got out. But they can always find us. That tracker." She looked at the blinking red pulse. "It means they're close." Calen stood, grabbing his tool belt. "How close?" Lyra hesitated. "If it's blinking that fast, by nightfall." He moved fast, locked the windows, reinforced the door, activated the thermal shield, loaded his old energy rifle. The charge cell was only half full, but it would have to do. Lyra stood behind him, watching. "You don't have to do this," she said. He turned. "I know." "Then why are you?" Calen looked at her, voice quiet. "Because no one fought for me either, and I know how that feels." The hours passed slowly. Outside, the snow began again, thick, heavy, silent. Inside, Calen adjusted the heat coil. Lyra sat near the wall, staring at her hands. He handed her a device, a square, thin module. "What is it?" she asked. "A short-range comm jammer. If they try to scan the shelter, this will muddy their feed. Might buy us a few minutes." She held it like it was something sacred. "You fixed this?" "I fix broken things. It's what I used to do." Lyra smiled, just barely. "Then maybe that's why you found me." For a while there was silence again, but it didn't feel empty. It felt warm. Then, a sound, a sharp beep. The tracker in Calen's pocket lit up, bright red. Lyra's breath caught. "They're here." Calen stood, grabbed his rifle. His face was calm, steady, quiet like snow just before it breaks. "Whatever happens," he said, "stay in the back room. Don't come out unless I call you." Lyra stared at him, fear rising in her chest. "They'll kill you." Calen gave a small smile. "Then they'll have to try." And with that, the man who once came to Zephyra to disappear stepped outside, not to hide, but to protect. Snow fell in quiet curtains as Calen stepped out into the open, his breath already catching in the frozen air. He crouched low behind the ridge near the shelter, rifle steady, every nerve tuned to the horizon. Then he saw it, a ship, dark and wide, gliding down with unnatural silence, settling just 100 meters from the shelter. It looked like a rescue cruiser, smooth curves, blue underlights, the kind of ship meant to carry diplomats or survivors. Too polished, too perfect. A voice crackled from a loudspeaker, soft and calm, cutting through the wind like a practiced performance. "We come in peace. We are here for Lyra of House Varel. Repeat, she is safe now." Calen didn't move. His finger tightened slightly on the rifle. His gut screamed. Too soon. Too clean. He tapped the comm link in his collar. Lyra, you hearing this? There was a pause. Then her voice came back, soft and trembling. Describe the ship. Dark hull, blue lights, medical crest on the side. Looks royal. Another pause, this one longer. That crest? That's from my mother's house. But that ship, it's supposed to be destroyed. Calen's eyes narrowed. So it's not a rescue. It's a trap. Her voice broke. They used her crest, her symbol, to make me believe. Below, the ship's ramp hissed and lowered. A figure stepped out, tall, robed in white, silver markings on his sleeves. His voice was honeyed, warm, practiced. I am Hevron. We received your signal. We've been searching for you, child. Come home. And then, to Calen's horror, the door behind him opened. Lyra stood in the snow. Her legs were weak, her frame wrapped in a thick coat. But her expression was something else entirely. Hope, wild and raw and dangerous. No, Calen hissed. Get back inside. It's not real. Let me see, she said. Just once. She walked forward slowly, each step uncertain but filled with purpose. Hevron stepped down the ramp, arms open, eyes soft. You served my mother, Lyra said. He bowed slightly. I still do, and now I carry her wish. Your return. Lyra trembled. She died. In the firestorms. They told me. No, Hevron said gently. They lied. She lives. She's waiting. Her eyes filled with tears. For a breath, she wanted to believe. She wanted to run, to collapse into arms that felt like home. She took one step forward. Then Calen's scope caught it. Beneath Hevron's sleeve, a flicker, a metallic twitch, a hidden stun baton. Lyra didn't see it, but Calen did. He fired. The blast tore through Hevron's robe, dropping him to the snow with a cry. Behind him, soldiers leapt from the ship. Black suits, stun rifles, full masks. Lyra dropped flat. Allery down, Calen shouted, using the name she had whispered once in her sleep. She obeyed without hesitation. The soldiers spread quickly. One raised a weapon toward her. Calen shot first. The bolt took the soldier in the shoulder, sending him spinning into the ice. Another ducked behind the ridge. A third aimed at Calen, but before the trigger was pulled, a burst of light exploded from Lyra's palm. The soldier flew back, unconscious. She stared at her hand in shock, the glow still fading from her skin. I didn't even know I had that much left, she whispered. Calen rushed to her side, grabbed her wrist. Inside. Now they ran together, boots slipping in the snow, heartbeats pounding in sync. Calen slammed the door behind them, bolted it, locked the heat shield. Lyra gasped for breath, eyes wide. I almost believed them. Calen panted, resting his hands on his knees. They nearly got you. She looked down. I wanted it to be real. He turned to her, his voice gentler. That doesn't make you weak. It makes me desperate. No, he said. It makes you human. Outside, the ship lifted back into the sky. They didn't try again. Not yet. But Calen knew they would return. Inside, Lyra sat near the heater, arms wrapped around her knees. Her voice was barely audible. They used her voice. Calen looked up. What? It was my mother's voice. They copied it. The pitch, the words. It sounded like her. Calen didn't speak for a long time. Then finally he said, sometimes the cruelest thing your enemy can give you is hope. Lyra nodded, tears shining in the firelight. But you didn't fall for it, Calen said. Not all the way. She looked up. I didn't come back because I saw the truth. I came back because I chose you. Calen's breath caught. In that moment, between two fugitives in the middle of nowhere, something unspoken passed between them. Not romance, not promises, just something real, something worth fighting for. The storm came back angry. Thick snow slammed against the shelter's walls like fists made of ice, and the wind howled like a wounded animal circling its prey. Inside, the lights flickered low, barely holding on. Calen paced the narrow hallway, boots thudding softly on the metal floor. Lyra lay curled near the heater, wrapped in layers of blankets, but still shaking. Her skin was pale again, paler than before. Her breath shallow, lips cracked, eyes closed. The energy she had unleashed against the soldiers had done more than drain her. It was devouring her. Calen knelt beside her, checking her pulse. Weak, her forehead burned, but her hands were ice. He touched her shoulder gently. "Hey, stay with me." Her eyelids fluttered. She looked at him, dazed. "They're coming again." He nodded. "They're already here." He moved to the backup locker, pulled out the last emergency power cell, and shoved it into the wall socket. The heater buzzed, coughed, then hummed back to life. Lights returned, faint and golden. He turned to her. "You need to rest." Lyra shook her head weakly. "Number, they took something from me." "What do you mean?" She lifted her hand slowly. Light crackled across her fingers, unstable, wild, flickering like a dying star. Part of my mind, my mother's voice, my own name. They pulled it from me when I was captured. Calen knelt beside her again. "You're burning up." Number, her voice was a whisper. "I'm waking up." The first explosion hit the outer wall like a thunderclap. The whole room shook. Dust fell from the ceiling. A mug shattered on the floor. Calen was already on his feet, grabbing the rifle. The second blast tore a fist-sized hole near the southeast corner. Snow rushed in, sharp and fast. Through the gap, a voice echoed, calm and cold. "This ends now. Hand her over." It was Vex, the man who had overseen the project, the one who created what Lyra had become. Calen looked at her. She tried to stand but collapsed again. He caught her, panic rising. "You're not strong enough." Her voice cracked. "You'll die if you fight them." He looked her in the eyes and whispered, "Not before they do." The next few minutes were chaos. Vex and his team charged the shelter. The front wall caved inward from a blast. Calen fired from behind cover, precise and fast. Years of training snapped back into muscle memory. One soldier fell, then another. But they kept coming. Too many. Too fast. A figure lunged through the smoke, tackled Calen. They crashed into the floor, grappling. A fist slammed into his ribs. Calen twisted, brought his rifle up, but it was knocked away. The soldier raised a blade. Then, a flash. Blue light exploded from behind. The soldier was thrown across the room, landing hard. Calen turned. Lyra was standing, barefoot, glowing. Her eyes pulsed with energy. Her skin shimmered faint blue, her hair floating around her like it had caught a solar breeze. "I'm done hiding," she said. Calen stared, breathless. She stepped past him, into the center of the room. Vex stood at the opening, weapon raised. "I'll erase you," he snarled. "Just like the others." Lyra raised her hand, palm glowing. "Number," she whispered. "I remember now." Vex fired. The energy blast screamed through the air, but stopped. Just before it touched her, it hit a wall of light. Her shield. It flared, then shattered the blast like glass. Lyra stepped forward and released everything. A wave of energy burst outward in a ring of silver-blue flame. Vex screamed, lifted from the ground and hurled into the snow. His mask cracked. His armor split. He didn't get back up. Silence followed. The wind outside slowed. The snow calmed. It was over. Lyra fell to her knees, the glow fading. Calen ran to her, caught her before she collapsed. She was burning up again, her breath shallow. "Is it done?" she whispered. He nodded. "You stopped him." She smiled barely. "I didn't think I could." He held her tighter. "You didn't have to, but you did anyway." She closed her eyes. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you." Calen looked at her gently. "You did, just not in the way I expected." That night, Calen buried the soldiers far from the shelter. The storm began to clear. Stars returned, small, distant, but bright. Inside, Lyra slept beside the fire, finally breathing easy. Calen sat next to her, cradling a mug of lukewarm tea. He stared into the flames, his mind quiet for the first time in years. She turned to him. "Why didn't you give up?" He thought for a long moment, then said, "Because I wasn't alone anymore." The sky over Zephyr 9 was clear for the first time in days. Sunlight reached across the frozen mountains, not warm enough to melt the snow, but enough to paint it gold. The wind had died, leaving only a stillness that felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. Inside the shelter, the fire flickered low. The last logs crackled as heat whispered into the air, but even the warmth couldn't touch her now. Lyra lay on the cot, her breathing thin and shallow. Calen sat beside her, one hand holding hers, the other gripping a med scanner with trembling fingers. The screen flickered red. Low vitals, unstable energy signatures, rising cellular collapse. Her body had paid the price. Too much power, too much light too quickly, and now she was fading. He had tried everything: injectors, stabilizers, pulse boosters. None of it worked. The energy she released to save them had turned inward, burning her from the inside out. He whispered her name, Lyra. No response. Her skin was cold, colder than the day he found her in the snow. He bowed his head. His breath hitched. His fingers tightened around hers. "Not like this," he whispered. "Please, not like this." Somewhere deeper, beyond the pain, beyond the cold, Lyra floated in darkness. She saw flashes, her mother's voice, the laboratory, the crash, the flames, then Calen's face, and then something else, a presence, not a voice, not a shape, just presence, ancient, gentle, familiar. "You carry a gift," it said. She turned toward the feeling. It was not meant to destroy. It was made to heal. In the shelter, Calen tried one last time. A new serum, a final patch. Nothing. Then, her chest glowed faintly, software blue, like moonlight underwater. Her lips parted. "You?" Calen leaned in, heart pounding. "I'm here. I'm right here." Her eyes opened just slightly. Glassy. Dimensions. "Your heart is cracked." He gave a soft laugh, tears rising. "That's no secret. I can fix it," she whispered. "No, you need your strength. Just rest." But she shook her head. "I was made for war, but I choose something better. One final gift, from my life to yours." Her hand rose, trembling. She touched his chest, and the light spread. It poured from her skin into his like liquid stars. It filled his bones, his lungs, his scars. Not just the ones on his body, but the ones in his memory. The boy he couldn't save. The years he lost in silence. All of it was healing. He felt warmth deeper than pain, deeper than guilt. It was her voice, her memory, her soul. He tried to pull away. Don't do this," she smiled faintly. "You gave me time, a name, a home." Her light flickered, then dimmed, and Lyra was gone. Calen sat beside the cot for hours. He didn't speak, didn't move. Only the soft sound of the wind returned to fill the silence she left behind. Her hand lay still in his. Her body was quiet. But he wasn't empty. Not anymore. He stood slowly, walked outside. The snow crunched beneath his boots. The world looked the same, but something shimmered in the ice near the shelter's entrance. A small crystal. He picked it up. It pulsed faintly, glowing blue from within, and her voice echoed, soft, clear, alive. "This is not an end. I'm part of you now. Carry me forward." Calen's hands closed around the light, and for the first time in years he smiled. The snow no longer felt hostile. It still fell in thick, endless sheets. The wind still howled across the ridges of Zephyr 9, like it always had. But Calen no longer feared it. He no longer turned away from the cold, because now when he stepped outside, her voice moved with him. Weeks passed. He rebuilt the shelter, not because he needed to survive, but because it deserved to stand. A place where someone was saved, a place where someone chose something better. He kept her cot just the way it was, a folded blanket, a small light on the wall, glowing faint blue. The crystal never left his chest. He had fashioned a simple pendant for it, wrapped in metal wire and memory. When he held it, it pulsed softly, not as a machine, but as a heartbeat. Her presence, her gift, her choice. And Calen lived, not just endured. He fixed things again, rewired the signal dish, salvaged 2 more energy cells from the wreck in the ravine, repaired an old med drone just for company. He even laughed once, watching it bump repeatedly into the same wall like a lost puppy. The silence didn't haunt him anymore. It kept her voice alive. Then one day the sky cracked open. A ship broke through the clouds. Not a war vessel, not the fake rescue craft of the Calen syndicate. This one was human. A rescue crew, years late to respond to his old distress signal, a signal Calen couldn't remember ever sending. They found him in the snow, rifle slung across his shoulder, eyes steady, calm. "You're lucky to be alive," they said. He nodded, didn't say much. They asked who he was. He paused, then answered, "Just someone who was found the day he chose to save someone else." Years passed. Stories spread. People whispered of a man who once lived alone on a dead world and saved an alien girl from the ice. Some said she was a weapon. Others said she was a ghost. But all agreed on one thing: he never left her behind. Eventually, Calen moved to the edge of a quiet colony near the stars. Not to fight, not to hide, to help. He opened a small clinic. No signs, no logos, just a single glowing symbol on the wall, a flame inside an open hand, and beneath it, a name carved in quiet light. Lyra. He never told the full story, not to the children he healed, not to the pilots he patched up, not to the woman who once asked if he had ever been in love. But sometimes when the wind howled just right against the clinic windows, and the lights flickered blue for no reason at all, he would close his eyes and whisper, "I'm still carrying you," and the pendant on his chest would grow just a little warmer. The stars above the colony didn't blink. They burned, cold and steady, like the universe was holding a secret just beyond the reach of time. Calen stood at the edge of the rooftop, the wind brushing his coat, the quiet of the clinic behind him. Below, the city was calm. Lights glowed in soft patterns, distant laughter echoed through the alleys, and somewhere nearby, a lullaby hummed through an open window. He looked up. Above him, the sky stretched wide and endless. And there it was, a shimmer, a soft ripple of blue that moved across the upper atmosphere like a wave no one else could see. He smiled. She was still watching. Inside the clinic, the walls whispered history. No digital records, no photos, just memories etched into every screw and stone. The children who came here never asked about the flame symbol on the wall, but sometimes they would trace it with their fingers. They said it made them feel warm. They never knew her name, but they felt it. In the way Calen moved, in the way he listened, in the way he never raised his voice, even when the pain was bad, even when the wounds were deep. They felt her in him, and that was enough. One night, a girl came in, small, quiet, trembling with fever. Her mother was frantic. They had traveled days to reach him. No one else would help. No one else believed the girl could be saved. Calen did not promise miracles. He just knelt beside the child, placed his hand over her chest, and whispered the same thing he had said long ago, on a different world. "You're safe now." Later, when the girl slept peacefully and the mother wept softly in the next room, Calen sat by the old heater, holding the pendant in his hand. It still glowed. Faint, but steady. "You chose me," he whispered, "and I'll keep choosing you. Every day." The galaxy would go on. Wars would come and go. Names would rise and fall. But in a small clinic at the edge of the stars, there would always be a place where the light never faded, where one man remembered, where one girl's choice changed everything. And now to you, who followed this story to the end. Ask yourself, if you were Calen, would you have walked into that storm? Would you have carried her home? And if you were Lyra, would you have given your light away? Tell us in the comments. Because sometimes the smallest decision, the quietest choice, is the one that echoes across the stars. Thank you for staying with us through this journey. If her story moved you, if his choice meant something to you, leave a comment, share a thought, or simply type her name. Because in remembering her, we carry her forward. HFY Obsession.